It happened so quietly, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. The sound, the shift, the faintest rustle of sheets. But I wasn't imagining it, because I could feel him right there behind me. The night was thick, the kind that wraps around you, not with comfort, but with weight. The kind that makes the air heavy in your lungs, makes every sound sharper, every breath louder. I lay on my side, my back to him, eyes closed, my chest rising and falling in a rhythm so perfectly measured. It could have been set to a metronome, pretending to be asleep, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to know. Wanted to know if the glances I caught him giving me earlier were real, if the way his laugh seemed softer when it was just the two of us meant something, if the space between us, in this bed, in this room, would stay empty. It didn't. At first, there was nothing. Just the hum of the ceiling fan above us, the distant tap of rain on the window, and the slow, even breathing of a boy I called my best friend for years. I counted each inhale, each exhale, until I almost slipped into believing we were just two friends sharing a bed like we always had. And then I felt it, his hand moving, slowly. So slowly it could have been a trick of the mattress. But no, this was deliberate. The edge of his fingers brushed the blanket tentative, like they weren't sure if they were allowed to exist in my space. My heartbeat stuttered. I kept my body still, my breathing steady. Because any shift, any twitch, any sign of awareness would shatter the fragile thread of whatever was happening. He paused, maybe listening to me breathe, maybe deciding whether to go further. The seconds stretched like hours. And then his hand crept forward again, just enough that the back of his fingers grazed the side of my shirt. A current shot through me, not the lightning bolt kind of shock, but the low, steady hum that makes your skin aware of itself. I thought about earlier that evening, the way we'd sat on the couch, legs touching just slightly, neither of us moving away. The way his eyes had lingered on mine when I spoke. The way I'd looked away first, because holding his gaze too long felt like standing too close to the edge of something I didn't understand yet. Now here we were, and he was the one leaning closer to that edge. His fingers stayed there, not moving, but not retreating, like they were waiting for permission. I wanted to turn over. I wanted to look at him, to see if his eyes were open, if they were fixed on me the way I thought they were. But I didn't, because right now, the not knowing was almost better than the truth. Then the mattress dipped slightly. He was moving closer. His breath reached me first, warm against the back of my neck, the kind of warmth that seeps past skin and into bone. I swallowed, carefully, making sure the movement of my throat didn't give me away. His chest was almost touching my back now. Not quite, but enough that I could feel the rise and fall of it. My mind was a riot. Flashes of every sleepover we'd ever had. Every time we'd shared a blanket, watching movies. Every time his hand had accidentally brushed mine, and I pretended not to notice. Maybe they weren't accidents. I didn't know how long we stayed like that. Me pretending to sleep, him pretending he wasn't hovering in the space just before contact. And then it happened. He whispered my name. Soft, almost fragile, like it might break if he said it any louder. It wasn't a question. It wasn't casual. It was something else. I froze, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't trust my body not to turn around, not to ruin this moment we weren't supposed to have. So I stayed still. I let him think I was asleep. But I knew, whatever this was, whatever this meant, this night had already crossed a line. The morning came, but it didn't rush in. It crept pale and quiet, slipping through the curtains in thin strips of light that landed across the floorboards like faded ribbons. The air in the room was still heavy from the night before, as if the darkness hadn't entirely left. I didn't move at first. My body was caught somewhere between the weight of sleep and the sharpness of being fully awake. My eyes stayed closed, partly because I wasn't ready to see him yet, and partly because I was afraid of what I might see. The hum of the ceiling fan spun overhead, slow, steady. The sound was familiar, almost comforting, except my chest wasn't calm. It was loud in there, messy. The memory of last night played in my mind on a loop. The shift of the mattress, the warmth of his breath, the almost touch that felt louder than any word he'd ever said to me. And then the whisper, my name, caught somewhere between a confession and a question. I opened my eyes just a fraction, enough to see the blur of the room. He was still there, his back to me, breathing slow. If anyone walked in right now, they'd think we just slept. Just slept? But I knew better. That space between us last night, that invisible line we'd never crossed. It wasn't there anymore, and I didn't know if I wanted it back. I let my eyes trace the back of his head, the way his hair stuck up at the crown where it had pressed against the pillow, the way his shoulders rose and fell with every breath. Every detail felt sharper this morning, like I was noticing him in a way I hadn't before. I thought about turning over, about saying his name just to see what he'd do. But the fear of breaking whatever this was, this strange, fragile thing hanging between us, kept me still. The minutes stretched. Then, a shift, he moved, just slightly, stretching his legs under the blanket before curling them back in. His arm adjusted, his fingers brushing the fabric between us like he was searching for warmth. I rolled onto my back slowly, quietly, my eyes fixed on the ceiling now. It was safer not to look at him. At least, that's what I told myself. The fan spun above, the same slow circle over and over. I matched my breathing to it, trying to calm the pounding in my chest. But the moment I closed my eyes again, I heard it, the bed springs groaning faintly as he shifted. And then he turned over. I felt his eyes on me before I opened mine. When I did, we met. It wasn't a long look, barely 2 seconds. But it was enough for 1,000 unspoken things to pass between us. There was no smile, no frown, just something unreadable, something that made my stomach tighten. Morning, he said finally, voice low, still heavy with sleep. I swallowed before answering. Morning. It was the most ordinary exchange in the world, and yet it felt like we were speaking in code. We didn't talk about the night. We didn't mention the hand or the whisper or the fact that I'd been awake for every second of it. Instead, he sat up, ran a hand through his hair, and swung his legs off the bed. I'll make coffee, he muttered, like the only thing worth discussing at this hour was caffeine. I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything else. I waited until he'd left the room before letting out the breath I didn't realize I was holding. The moment he was gone, the room felt emptier, colder. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at the floor. The sunlight was brighter now, but it didn't feel warm. Everything felt suspended. By the time I made my way to the kitchen, the smell of coffee had filled the apartment. He stood at the counter, pouring it into 2 mugs. He glanced at me when I entered, quick, almost casual, but there was something in his eyes. And then it happened. The corner of his mouth twitched. Not enough to be a smile. Not enough to mean nothing. Just enough. Enough to let me know he remembered. Enough to let me know he knew I remembered too. We sat across from each other at the table, sipping coffee in silence. The clink of the spoon against the mug felt louder than it should. Every time his eyes flicked up to mine, I looked away first. The conversation we weren't having filled the room. Every second was heavy with it. And as much as I told myself I should say something, I didn't. Because maybe some things feel bigger when they're left unsaid. The day started like it was trying to convince us nothing had happened. Sunlight poured into the kitchen window, spilling across the table, touching the steam rising from our coffee mugs. It was the kind of morning that should have felt simple. It didn't. We sat there in silence, the air between us dense with everything unsaid. He took a sip, glanced at me over the rim of his mug, and then looked away before I could hold his gaze. I pretended not to notice. He pretended not to be avoiding it. There was no mention of the night, no mention of my name whispered into the dark, no mention of the almost touch that still lingered like static under my skin. When we finished our coffee, he stood, rinsed his mug, and asked if I wanted to go out later. The question was casual, almost too casual, but there was something in the way he asked, like he needed us to be seen in daylight, doing normal things, to prove that we were still who we'd always been. Sure, I said, my voice steady, though my pulse wasn't. We ended up walking into town. The streets were alive with the hum of a Saturday afternoon. Shop doors open, music spilling out from somewhere we couldn't see, the smell of fresh bread drifting from a bakery. We talked about nothing. Sports scores, the weather, a movie we'd both already seen twice. Every word felt like camouflage, but underneath, I was watching him, not in the obvious way, just enough to notice things. The way his hands stayed in his pockets more than usual. The way he kept glancing at shop windows we weren't stopping at. The way he laughed once. Not the full kind of laugh, just a small one that felt like an obligation. When we stopped at a small diner for lunch, the hostess led us to a booth by the window. He slid in across from me, the sun lighting his face in a way that made it hard to look at him without thinking of last night. The waitress took our order. We both thanked her, and then silence again. I stirred my drink just to have something to do with my hands. He rested his elbows on the table, leaning forward slightly, as if he was about to speak. But whatever words he was going to say didn't come out. Something wrong? I asked finally, my voice low. His eyes flicked to mine. For a second, I thought he might tell me. But then he shook his head. Nah, just tired. It was a lie. I could feel it. The food came. We ate. We didn't talk much. On the walk back, he reached into his pocket for his phone, pretending to check a message. But I caught it. The quick glance at me before his eyes dropped to the screen. Like he wanted to measure my face when I wasn't looking. When we got home, he dropped his keys on the counter and muttered something about taking a shower. The bathroom door closed. I leaned against the wall, exhaling like I'd been holding my breath since we'd left the diner. The sound of water running filled the apartment. I could picture him in there, head tipped back, water streaming down his shoulders. His mind maybe playing back the same night mine was. When he came out, hair damp, shirt clinging slightly to his chest, he looked at me, just for a moment. And for that moment, I was sure we were both back in that dark room. But he walked past without a word. The rest of the evening stretched slow. We watched TV. Or at least, the TV was on. Neither of us was really watching. Every so often, our eyes would meet and dart away again. By the time night came, I could feel the pull of that unspoken thing between us like gravity. It didn't matter how many steps I took away from it. It was still there. When we finally headed to bed, the question wasn't if it would happen again. It was when. The day had been long. Too long. Not in the hours it took to pass, but in the way every moment felt stretched thin, held taut by something neither of us dared to touch. By evening, the apartment had settled into that familiar weekend quiet, the kind where the outside world feels far away, where the only sounds are the faint hum of the fridge and the low, steady beat of whatever show plays on the TV. Except I couldn't focus on the screen. Not when he was sitting right there. We were both on the couch, him at one end, me at the other. A blanket was draped over both our legs, his side, my side, not quite meeting in the middle. He leaned back, one arm stretched across the top of the couch, his eyes on the flickering light of the TV. From the corner of my eye, I could see the way his fingers tapped idly against the fabric. I wondered if he was even paying attention to the show, or if he, like me, was replaying the moments that had been haunting us since that night. An episode ended. The opening credits of another started. Neither of us moved to change it. Want another drink? He asked suddenly, his voice breaking the low hum of the room. I shook my head. I'm good. He nodded, but didn't get up either. Instead, he shifted. Not much, just enough to turn slightly toward me. His knee brushed mine under the blanket. It could have been an accident. It wasn't. The warmth of that small touch spread faster than I wanted it to. I told myself to move my leg. I didn't. He didn't pull away either. We stayed like that, eyes still on the screen, bodies pretending not to notice the way they'd started leaning in. When the next commercial came on, he spoke again. You tired? I thought about lying. Instead, I said, not really. He nodded slowly, his gaze flicking toward me before returning to the screen. Me neither. The words felt heavier than they should have. By the time the credits rolled again, the blanket had shifted enough that it was pulled tighter over both of us, a single layer of fabric now stretched across the small space between our bodies. His arm was still along the back of the couch, close enough that if I leaned back even slightly, it would touch my shoulder. I could feel his eyes on me, not for long stretches, just little glances, testing, waiting. Eventually, he stood, stretching his arms above his head before heading to the kitchen. The sound of the fridge door opening and closing reached me. A few moments later, he came back with 2 glasses of water, setting one on the table in front of me without a word. "Thanks," I said softly. He just nodded, then sat back down, closer this time. The show kept playing. The room stayed dim. The quiet between us was alive. It was late when we finally switched off the TV. Neither of us had suggested bed, but the unspoken agreement was there. We moved to the bedroom without discussion. The bed felt different tonight, not in the way it looked, but in the way the space between us had shrunk. I lay on my side, facing the wall again. It felt safer. Or maybe it just felt familiar, like repeating the same move from a night before with some sort of shield. He shifted behind me. The sound of the blankets rustling, the subtle dip of the mattress. I knew exactly how close he was without turning my head. For a long time, nothing, just breathing. His mind blending into the rhythm of the dark. And then that movement again, slow, hesitant, like a hand testing the air before reaching out. Fingers brushing the edge of the blanket, lingering there before retreating slightly, then inching forward again. Every muscle in my body was tense, but my breathing stayed slow, steady. His hand grazed my side, the lightest touch, almost not there, before pausing. A breath, 2, and then contact. It wasn't bold. It wasn't a grab or a grip, just his palm resting lightly against my hip through the fabric of my shirt. But it was enough. I could feel the heat of him, the slow, deliberate way his fingers curled just slightly, holding that spot like it meant something. He didn't move for a long while, and neither did I. Then his thumb moved, just the faintest stroke against the fabric. It was nothing. It was everything. The air felt heavier. My mind was loud with things I couldn't say. I could have turned then, faced him, asked what he was doing, but I didn't, because in that moment, I didn't want answers. I wanted to feel him there. I wanted to know how far he'd go before the night gave him back his restraint. Minutes passed. His hand didn't leave. Eventually, I felt him shift, not away, but closer. His chest almost against my back now. His breath brushing the curve of my neck. And then, just like before, my name. Only this time, it wasn't as soft. It wasn't trembling. It was lower, steadier, like he'd stopped asking for permission and started claiming the moment instead. I swallowed. My heartbeat felt too loud. Still, I didn't move. And that's when his forehead touched the back of my head. A quiet, unassuming gesture. But it made my whole body ache with the weight of what wasn't being said. We stayed like that. No more words. No more movement. But everything had changed. Again, the light came earlier than I wanted it to. Too bright. Too honest. The kind of light that didn't care what you'd done in the dark. I woke slowly, but not because I'd been asleep for long. It was the kind of slow waking that comes when your mind never really let go, when you hover at the edge of awareness all night, afraid to move in case you change something. He was still there, behind me, close enough that I could feel the faint trace of his body heat on my back, but not as close as last night. Somewhere between when my eyes had closed and when they'd opened again, he'd shifted back. Not far, but enough to make the air between us feel strange. I rolled onto my back, staring at the ceiling for a long time before daring to turn my head. He was lying on his side, facing me now, eyes closed. The morning light brushed against his face, softening everything. The curve of his jaw, the way his lashes rested against his skin, the faint crease between his brows that told me he wasn't as relaxed as he looked. I watched him breathe, slow, even, almost too even. Was he pretending, like I had that night? I didn't know which answer I wanted. The urge to say something, anything, rose and fell like the tide. If I said it now, if I asked, there would be no taking it back. And maybe I wasn't ready for that. So I didn't. Instead, I got up quietly, the floorboards creaking under my feet as I made my way to the kitchen. The air was cooler here, sharper somehow, but it didn't clear my head. I set the kettle on. The sound of the water heating filled the silence. My hands moved automatically, mugs, sugar, spoons, but my mind was still in that bed, still replaying the weight of his hand against my hip, the way his voice had sounded when it said my name. By the time I heard his footsteps in the hallway, my chest had already tightened. "Morning," he said as he walked in. His voice was rough, the kind of rough that comes from more than just sleep. "Morning," I replied, keeping my tone light. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching me pour the coffee. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he asked, "Sleep okay?" It was such a normal question, so safe, and yet my throat went dry before I answered. "Yeah." "You?" "Yeah." He took the mug from me when I handed it over, our fingers brushing briefly. It was such a small contact, but I felt it everywhere. We drank in silence. The sound of the kettle cooling filled the background. I almost told him then, almost asked why he'd done it, almost admitted I hadn't been asleep, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he finished his coffee, set the mug down, and said, "I've got errands later. You want to come?" It was casual, too casual, and yet there was something under it, a thread of hesitation, like he wasn't sure if I'd say yes. "Sure," I said finally. He nodded, pushing away from the counter. And just like that, the moment was gone. The rest of the morning passed in fragments. We moved around each other easily, making breakfast, washing dishes, talking about nothing. But there was a strange choreography to it, like we were both aware of every step, every pause, every near touch. When we finally stepped outside, the air was crisp, the sun too bright for how tired I felt. We walked side by side down the street, our shoulders close but never touching. It felt like a line we were both testing without crossing. At the store, we split up briefly, him grabbing things from one aisle, me from another. When we met again by the checkout, he handed me something he'd picked up for me without asking. I almost smiled. Almost. The drive home was quiet. Not the comfortable kind. Not the tense kind either. Just the kind where both of you are too aware of what you're not saying. When we got back, he disappeared into the bedroom, leaving me in the living room with the groceries still on the counter. I put them away slowly, listening to the faint sounds of him moving around behind the closed door. By the time he came out again, the sun was lower in the sky. He stood there for a moment, leaning on the doorway, looking at me like he was about to speak. But he didn't, and neither did I. That night, when we climbed into bed, I wondered if it would happen again, if his hand would find me in the dark, if he'd say my name the way he had before. But it didn't. He stayed on his side. I stayed on mine. And somehow, that felt heavier than anything. The day bled into night in that quiet, unremarkable way. The kind of day where you could almost convince yourself nothing had happened. Almost. We'd gone through the motions, food, TV, a few harmless jokes, but it all felt like we were playing roles. He laughed in the right places. I smiled when I should. But beneath it, there was something restless, something waiting. When the clock crept past midnight, we were still awake. The glow from the muted TV painted the room in shifting blues and grays. He was sprawled at one end of the couch, legs stretched out, a blanket half tangled around him. I was at the other end, sitting cross-legged, trying not to let my eyes linger on the bare skin where his t-shirt had ridden up. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, rattling faintly. It felt like the whole apartment was holding its breath. At some point, I stood and stretched, mumbling, "I'm heading to bed." He didn't move right away, just watched me for a beat too long before nodding. By the time I brushed my teeth and climbed into bed, the room was still cold from earlier. The sheets felt heavier than usual. I lay there, facing the wall, listening for his footsteps. They came eventually, soft, slow, and then the click of the light switch. The mattress dipped under his weight, and the scent of him filled the air almost instantly. That mix of laundry detergent and something that was just him. We didn't speak, but the silence wasn't empty. It was thick, crowded, Minutes passed, or maybe longer, and then I felt it. Not a hand this time, just movement, a shift in the mattress as he turned toward me, the faint brush of the blanket pulling tighter. I kept still, too still, the kind of still that only comes when you're pretending. His breath was closer now, slow, steady, and I could feel the warmth on the back of my neck. It sent a shiver down my spine that I tried to hide. Then, a pause. "Hey," he whispered. It wasn't loud, but in the quiet of the room, it felt deafening. I swallowed hard. "Yeah." Another pause, longer this time, like he was working up to something. He stopped. I heard the faint rustle of fabric as his hand tightened in the blanket. I can't stop thinking about that night. My pulse kicked hard against my ribs. He didn't have to say which night. I knew. I waited for him to keep going, to explain, to admit, but instead, he let out a quiet laugh, the kind people use when they're trying to downplay something that matters. It's stupid. Forget I said anything. I turned then, slowly. The darkness between us was thin, the kind that still let you see the outline of a face. His eyes found mine, and for a moment neither of us blinked. "It's not stupid," I said, my voice lower than I intended. Something flickered in his expression, relief, maybe, or fear, maybe both. We stayed like that, lying face to face, for what felt like forever, the space between us shrinking with every second. I thought he was going to close it. I thought I was going to let him. But then he rolled onto his back, staring up at the ceiling, and the moment cracked apart like thin glass. "Good night," he murmured. I lay there, staring at the curve of his profile in the dark. I wanted to reach for him. I wanted to say his name. I wanted to tell him I hadn't been asleep. But instead, I closed my eyes and let the silence have us again. The morning after was all wrong. Not because anything had happened, but because something hadn't. And that absence was louder than anything else. I woke to the sound of him in the kitchen. The faint clink of a mug against the counter, the low hum of the kettle. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, my chest heavy with the weight of the night before. When I finally dragged myself out of bed, the smell of coffee was waiting for me along with him. He was leaning against the counter, scrolling through his phone, the mug warm in his hand. He glanced up when I walked in. Morning. Just that. No mention of last night. No trace of the whisper, the almost confession. Morning. I echoed, my voice tighter than I meant. We talked about nothing. The weather, groceries, a stupid meme he'd seen, but it all felt flimsy, like a conversation wearing a disguise. And yet, every time our eyes met, there was a flicker, a beat too long, a hint that maybe he hadn't forgotten either. By late afternoon, the sky was already bruising with clouds. Rain came slow at first, then harder, drumming against the windows, turning the world outside into a blur. He suggested we watch a movie. I agreed, not because I cared about the movie, but because it meant sitting close without having to explain why. The couch was warm from the blanket we shared, our legs brushing now and then, little sparks I pretended not to notice. Halfway through, a loud crack of thunder rattled the glass, and I felt him shift closer, like instinct. The movie kept playing, but I wasn't watching. I was aware of every breath he took, every subtle movement, the faint, clean smell of his skin. Then, without looking away from the screen, he said it, quietly, almost like he was talking to himself. I wasn't asleep either. It was like my chest forgot how to work. My heart stuttered, then pounded hard enough that I was sure he could hear it. I turned my head slowly, searching his face. He still wasn't looking at me. His gaze was fixed on the flickering light of the TV. The urge to ask when, or what do you mean, tangled on my tongue. But I didn't have to. I knew. He shifted then, just slightly, his knee pressing more firmly against mine. Not by accident. Not this time. I waited, and then I felt it. His hand, resting on my thigh. Not moving, just there. The weight of it sent a current straight through me. I could have pulled away. I didn't. Instead, I breathed in slow, keeping my eyes on the screen, letting him decide how far this went. For a while, it was just that, the heat of his palm, the steady rhythm of the rain outside, the flicker of light across our faces. But then his thumb began to move, small, slow strokes that barely skimmed the fabric of my sweats. Every nerve in my body was suddenly awake. The air between us tightened. The sound from the TV felt distant, muffled, irrelevant. I swallowed hard. "Why are you doing that?" I asked, my voice low. That made him look at me. Really look. His eyes were darker in the dim light, the edges soft in the glow of the TV. Because he hesitated. His thumb stilled. Because I can't pretend anymore. The room felt smaller, like the walls had leaned in to listen. I didn't trust myself to speak, so I didn't. I just stayed there, letting his words settle over me, sink into me. And then the corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, not quite anything. His hand slid back, slow, like he was giving me space to object. I didn't. When it reached mine, I turned my palm up, lacing our fingers together. The contact was simple, almost innocent, but it was also the first time we'd both admitted, without saying it, that there was something here. The rain kept falling. The movie played on. But the only thing I could feel was the warmth of his hand in mine and the quiet certainty that nothing would be the same after this. Eventually, he leaned back against the couch, still holding on, his thumb tracing idle patterns across my skin. It was a touch I could feel everywhere. No big confession. No dramatic kiss. Just this. And somehow it was enough. For now, I couldn't sleep that night. Not because of the rain, though it kept falling, soft and steady against the windows, but because of the way his hand had felt in mine. How simple it was. How dangerous. I lay there in the dark, my eyes tracing the faint outline of the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of his breathing from the other side of the wall. Every inhale, every exhale, pulling me closer to the edge of something I'd been holding back from for too long. I told myself to let it go, to wait until morning, to not ruin whatever this was. But my body wasn't listening. My chest was tight. My skin was buzzing with the echo of his touch. It was past midnight when I gave in. I pushed the blanket aside, my bare feet silent against the cold floor, and crossed the short hallway to his door. It was cracked open, just barely, enough to spill a sliver of light from the street lamp outside across the carpet. I stood there for a moment, my hand resting on the frame, my breath shaky. I could see him, lying on his side, back toward me, the rise and fall of his shoulders steady and slow. Asleep or pretending? Something in me wanted him to be pretending. I stepped inside, the air cooler here, tinged with the faint scent of his shampoo and laundry detergent. Every step was deliberate, careful, like if I made the wrong sound, the moment would collapse. When I reached the side of his bed, I hesitated. I could still walk away, go back to my own room, lock it all down again. But then he shifted, just a little, and I saw his hand resting on the edge of the blanket. I sat down slowly, the mattress dipping under my weight. He didn't move, didn't say a word. My heart was hammering as I reached out, fingertips brushing his wrist, light as a whisper. His skin was warm, familiar, and then his fingers curled, not away from me, around mine. My breath caught. "You're awake?" I said, not a question, not an accusation. His reply was soft, almost like he was afraid to break the quiet. "I was hoping you'd come." That sentence, it was enough to undo me. I slid under the blanket, the space between us charged, every inch closer decision I couldn't take back. When my chest met his back, he exhaled, slow, deliberate, like he'd been holding that breath all night. Neither of us moved for a long time, just breathing, letting the reality settle in. When his hand found mine again under the blanket, I didn't flinch. His thumb traced over my knuckles, slow, steady, like he was memorizing the shape of me. "I thought I was imagining it," he murmured. His voice was deeper in the dark, heavy with something I recognized because I'd been carrying it too. "That night when you stayed still." I swallowed, my mouth dry. "You weren't." Silence, but not the empty kind. This was thick, full, like the air between us had weight. He rolled onto his back, then onto his side facing me. The blanket shifted, warm air spilling in for a second before He tucked it back around us. His face was closer than I expected. The streetlight caught in his eyes, turning them softer, deeper. "I don't know what this means," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I know I don't want to stop." My chest felt like it might split open. Every excuse I'd made, every line I'd drawn, was blurring. I could either step back or fall. So I fell. I lifted my hand, brushing my fingertips along his jaw, the faint stubble rough under my skin. He closed his eyes, leaning into the touch like it was something he'd been waiting for. And then his hand came up to cover mine, holding it there. When he opened his eyes again, there was no hesitation left. The space between us disappeared. The first touch of his lips was almost nothing, a ghost of a kiss, testing, waiting for me to push away. I didn't. I leaned in, deepening it, feeling the soft give of his mouth, the way his breath caught. The world outside didn't matter anymore. Not the rain, not the hour, not the rules I'd told myself I wouldn't break. By the time we pulled back, my heart was beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. He rested his forehead against mine, eyes closed. This was supposed to be a secret. I whispered, not sure if I was warning him or myself. "Then let it be," he said. "No one has to know, not yet." We stayed like that for what felt like hours, not speaking, just existing in the same breath, the same heat, the same truth. When sleep finally came, it was tangled, legs, arms, the steady rhythm of them against me. And in that small, quiet space between dreams, I realized I'd stopped pretending a long time ago.